welcome to the Wild Side. Hey, have you ever noticed that life can be a tangled mess of briars and thickets that's very hard to differentiate what your purpose in life is? Man, I've had seasons in my life that it has certainly seemed that my life was a mess. Well, there's nothing truer than the life of Joseph found in Genesis 39 through 46. There are really two narratives if you really casually read that story of Joseph. The first narrative really is the all-American dream. Young man favored. He had God that was present with him, and he prospered in everything that he did. Man, we all want to strive to do that. He also found favor in the eyes of men. And it is astounding because where he found his life later, he still rose to the top. He found favor in the eyes of men. And then there's a great passage that we need to understand here in Genesis 39 that Joseph was a man of great conviction. Boy, as he seemed to squash the advances of Potiphar's wife, he made wonderful decisions. So what a beautiful narrative. We would love to be able to have that narrative in our life. But there's the second narrative that we would never sign up for, that we would shun and certainly repress because life can be a tangled mess. Think with me just for a moment the second narrative. He was forsaken by his family, a band of brothers that sold him into slavery. He was absolutely abandoned. I've never been abandoned in my life, but I cannot imagine the horror that would be to be abandoned in such a manner of slavery. He was also falsely accused, if you remember, from Potiphar's wife and cast in prison, incarcerated for over 2 years. How difficult those times must have been. And then we find lastly, and probably the most difficult for me, is that he was simply forgotten by the cupbearer. Forgotten. Have you ever been forgotten? Felt like you were set on the shelf, that your ministry was no more, or at best just trying to be in survival mode? Boy, that life can be a tangled mess. But the reality is, if God is in the center of what you try to do every day, whatever that tangled mess is, God can unwind and weave a tapestry of color that perhaps can give you more content in who you really are. It can be very, very difficult. So what are the things that we learn in such a tangled web of life? Because there is the good, and then there is the difficult narrative. But we have to embrace the entire story of our life. A couple of conclusions that I think it might help you. I love what Ed Cole says in his book, Power to Perform. Really, he says this. He says that we are not defined by context, but by design. Context, not by design. You see, if we were defined by context, Joseph would have stayed in slavery. If we were defined by context, Joseph would have stayed in prison. If we would have been defined by context, Joseph would have been content to just live in Potiphar's house and run his household. But God had a better plan. It was to even go beyond Potiphar's house and end up in the palace of Pharaoh for a reason. We're not defined by context, but by design. That is a divine design that God wants to use us for. And that design is found later in chapter 26, we'll get for a moment. The second thing we can say is that our circumstances does not dictate the presence of God. Do you think Joseph felt that God was still present with him when he was enslaved? that he was in the bottom of a cistern, when he was imprisoned, when he was forgotten. There were some tough moments. Let's get real. There's days that it's so tough, it's hard to look up. But here's the reality. We are not defined by context, but by design. And we also understand that we can have the presence of God even though we don't seem to experience. God is faithful, He is just, and He has a love that is beyond description, particularly in the difficult narratives of our life. And then lastly, we must say this, that in suffering, in the difficult times of life, I have found that God uses those times to teach us the great and deep truths of God. Now, I would venture to say that Joseph may have had difficulty in trying to understand why he was enslaved, in prison, and forgotten. But we look at chapter 46. When Jacob is coming from Canaan because of a great famine, and God tells Jacob, the father of Joseph, do not be afraid to go to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation. I have a plan, I have purpose. And they gather together, and the reality is they come from Canaan with a number of 70 men plus wives, and they leave 450 years later, I believe, and it is millions. God was true to His word. Though it was not understood in prison, it wasn't understood in slavery, but God's purposes were fulfilled. I tell you, God is faithful. You keep your eyes on the Lord, and He will guide you, and He will direct you. And know that you have purpose in your life this year. God bless you.